you have to hand it to the ancient Romans. You know, these guys knew how to run an empire. They ran it for 1,500 years. And along the way, they learned a couple of nifty tricks. And today I want to talk about a really great tactic that was used. You may have heard the phrase bread and circuses. Well, bread and circuses was a political tactic used in ancient Rome. Whenever the Roman population were getting unhappy and revolution was in the air, what the leaders of ancient Rome would do is they would use this tactic of bread and circuses, where they would literally give bread, food, to the whole of Rome. Suddenly everybody would get a nice hot loaf of bread. And they would arrange circuses, the entertainment of the day. Circuses all over Rome, so people would go to the circus and be entertained, distract them from what they're unhappy about. It was a complete distraction tactic. Now, this tactic has been used in many respects in many countries and societies over the years. You distract from your problem over here. It's a bit like a magician. Here's the problem, but I want you to look over there. It's an old trick. You've got to distract people. And we, at the moment, are in the middle of a massive distraction program by the South African government and President Cyril Ramaphosa. What proves this has been this whole raft of new legislation that has come out. National health insurance, basic education amendment, basically the Bella Act as it's been known, expropriation without compensation. These weren't brought in to make the lives of South Africans better. They were brought in to distract you from the bigger problem. And in actual fact, the more these laws are contested, the better it is for the ANC, and the more they get taken to court, and the more President Donald Trump asks President Cyril Ramaphosa about some of this legislation, the better it is for the ANC, because it hides from the real problem. So what are the real problems? Well, we've got a couple, and we all know some of the problems, and the one that's hot right now, and it's one that's not getting nearly enough attention as it deserves, has been the Auditor General's local government report, which came out this week. And it makes absolutely dismal reading. Now, you've got to understand something about how our government, our constitution, and our state is run. And I think it's very clever as long as everybody does their job. Not so great. Like any system, it collapses when you don't do it properly. But what we really have is we've got, our national government sits there in Parliament, makes laws. Great, 400 of those people plus their Blue Light Brigade. Then you've got provincial government, which is sort of the idea was that you'd end up with almost a federal type of situation where one province would be better than the other, and they administer a few things. And then you've got local government. And local government is, as they say, where the rubber hits the road. That is where real delivery of services happen, because that's where you live. When you drive your car down the road, that is local government that gives you that road, that makes sure that it's maintained, or that the street lights are on, the traffic lights work, etc., etc. Most of your life is not lived in the realm of national legislation or even provincial stuff. It's lived under local government, whether you're in a big city or whether you're in a small town. There's a mayor or somebody who is running that particular city, town, district, whatever it is, that is meant to look after the stuff that matters. And that was what the Auditor General reported back on this week, and it is absolutely dismal. Well, it goes without saying. Let's start off with the big babies, the metros. South Africa has got 8 metros, as we call them, big cities. One is run by the DA, and that is Cape Town. And that is the only city that got a clean audit. No findings, no ifs, no buts. They spend the money where they say they're going to spend the money, and they account for it. 7 out of 8 do not get clean audits. These are cities. These are cities where you don't have to struggle to find an accountant or a lawyer, right? They're everywhere. But none of those cities get a clean audit. Only Metro that gets a clean audit is Cape Town. We've spoken a lot about the mess that is Gauteng, that houses 3 of the major metros, right? City of Tshwane, City of Johannesburg, City of Ekurhuleni. And they're in a bit of a dice. They're in their own competition to see which one is worse. One shudders to think that we're going to have the G20 summit up here in Johannesburg later this year, because it's an absolute mess. Each one of those metros is in terrible shape, and this is the economic heartland of South Africa, or it once was. Without that heart pumping, it's little wonder that our economy is in the mess that it is. So we keep on hearing, and yeah, we've got to try and work out what the media is reporting on the great performance in the city of Tshwane, where Action SA engineered a takeover together with the ANC and the EFF of the city of Tshwane. Now I have an Action SA mayor and a minority, one of those small parties, a bit of a puppet mayor, as we used to call them in Joburg. So in other words, she may be the mayor, but the people that really wield the power is the biggest party in that coalition, which is the ANC. So let's look at the findings that the Auditor General had in the city of Tshwane. Well, they've been downgraded. Okay, so now they have a qualified audit with findings, which means that not only didn't you do the paperwork, we've actually got question about some of the things that you did put out there. They've got 3 billion rands worth of irregular expenditure, which is more than Johannesburg. And their deputy mayor, just this week, there's a huge question mark. His name's Eugene Madis, is from the ANC. He holds a company that has over 100 million rands worth of government contracts in various other municipalities. On his civil servant salary, the guy has managed to run a fleet of 11 luxury vehicles. 11. Now, we'll talk about, personal audits. I don't think you have to be Sherlock Holmes to work out that the numbers don't compute too well. Got to be one of the best businessmen I've ever heard of. The only clean audit in the whole of Gauteng is in Midvaal, which happens to be the only municipality that is run by the Democratic Alliance. This is just stating facts here. This is not a political advert, but my word. So the smaller, if you go down a tier to the municipalities, that was the metros, the municipalities, 16%, 16%, receive clean audits. 16%. Half of those are in the Western Cape. In other words, of the 247 municipalities, 84% of them do not receive clean audits. But even Angie Motshekga, when she was Minister of Basic Education, had a pass mark of 30%. This is half of that. And of those 247 municipalities, 49 of them have got an uncertainty as to whether they can be classified as going concerns. In other words, that's a nice way of saying, if it was a business, they would be bankrupt and they'd be shut down. In all of our municipalities and local government, there is 32 billion rand of unauthorized expenditure. 32 billion rand of unauthorized expenditure. So now, just think about this. The hill that the ANC was prepared to die on was an increase in VAT, because they, as they said, we're going to have a shortfall of 78 billion rand over the next 3 years. And that's what the 2 percentage point increase that they had originally spoken about was meant to cover. That's over 3 years. We are wasting about 90 billion rand in unauthorized expenditure in local government, and not a word, not a word. Then I want to look at some of the local government projects, as they're called. These are typically roads that are going to be built, or hospitals, or housing, or water projects, or sanitation projects. 59, more than half out of 113 projects, are currently delayed. Delayed means that wonderful thing which we see all the time in Gauteng where there was building on a road and suddenly there's a pile of sand on the side of the road and a few beacons, but nobody ever comes back. And weeks later you say, I wonder what's happening here. They would say one day there were a lot of people here and the next day they weren't there. Well, I can tell you what happens is that the contractor gets paid to do the road. He then gets the next tranche of payments and decide, well, that's enough. I don't need to do it anymore. I've got enough money. And he just goes. And then that entity will give the rest of the job to somebody else. They'd have to retender. It's a mess, but it's a great way to make money. Let's talk about some of the other problems. We hear a lot about land. We hear a lot about who owns the land, especially farmland, where, according to the last land audit, whites own nearly 70% and whites own 50% of the property in South Africa that is owned privately. And we keep on hearing these things, and it's a national disgrace, and Cyril couldn't be more shocked if he tried. But try this one emphasized. The land audit that they use was done in 2017, 8 years ago. There's been no land audit since then. Why not? Because we're happy with those numbers. Now, those numbers would have changed in 8 years. My Lord, just think about where you were 8 years ago and how much land moves, in ownership between this time and that time. So in other words, we stick with the number we like. We don't get it re-audited as it should be, probably twice a year, I would imagine. There's things like pressing a button on a computer, surely, other than modern day. But no, you stick with the number you like. You don't do another audit, so that right now, if you have to say, what are land ownership figures in South Africa, go and do it. You're going to get the 2017 land audit because there hasn't been one done since then. Crime statistics. There was a time when we used to get crime statistics in South Africa monthly, but they were proving to be too embarrassing. And the then ANC Minister of Police said, no, every month you're going to question us on why we're doing such a bad job in policing. So what we'll do is, instead of doing a better job, we'll only release the statistics every quarter, as if that's going to help anything. Well, it does help, because what happens is that you only really think about it when these really terrible statistics come out. For a week, there's a whole lot of hand-wringing, and then it goes away because we've got lives to live. But it's a great bread and circuses tactic. You just don't give the statistics regularly enough. Why do you think our policing is so bad? Well, our criminal justice system, which is our policing, plus the legal system, in other words, when you get to court, is completely paper-based. Concentrate. This is 2025. If you go to court, somebody's got to bring a file full of documents, right? You don't open your laptop. You never see a judge with a laptop in front of him. No. You see a judge with paper in front of him. Everything is paper-based. Why is that? Well, for starters, it's inefficient. So if many of your members are going to be in those files, you would rather it doesn't go and sit in front of a judge. And then secondly, if you want the case to disappear, you have to make one file disappear, right? It's not like the rest of the world that you and I live in, where there's always a backup of something. There's always somewhere something. Stuff lives in the cloud. Stuff lives forever. Now, can you imagine your insurance company having everything on paper? I don't think they've done that in more than 30 years, right? But yet our entire legal justice system is paper-based. These are the kind of things that you need to detract people from, distract them. They mustn't look, they mustn't ask those questions. We know our erstwhile Minister of Transport, Fikile Mbalula, watching as the rail system was being carried away live on television. This is a guy who said that he feared all. Can you remember that? And here's the guy who sat in his office, didn't get out there to stop it, did nothing. Minister of Police did nothing. You need to distract people from that, right? So let me explain to you what some of the distraction is. That goes back to some of the law that has been passed. When you have a school system that is so different between the private schooling and the government schooling. You introduce the Bella Act. You say the reason our schools aren't good is because your schools are good. Therefore, we got to bring you back to our level. So you create law like Bella Act that says, no, you can't have Afrikaans schools because they're doing too well. We want all of our schools to be equally poor. When you have government hospitals that don't have food, don't have linen, don't have power, people are stealing everything, you blame the private hospitals that are run well or the medical aids that are providing that service. You introduce the national health insurance because it distracts. It's bread and circuses. It distracts you from saying, no, guys, the issue isn't private health. The issue is, why don't you run the government healthcare system better? When your policing doesn't work, you say, no, the problem with our policing and the reason it doesn't work is because the private security business is too big and too good. So you introduce this thing that's just gone through called SYRA, Private Security Industry Regulation Act. And basically what they're going to say is that it's going to make private security, render them almost useless because they can't carry firearms and this whole thing's being distracted. But once again, the issue is, if our policing was good, we wouldn't need a private security business. So instead of doing that, you clamp down on the service. When you don't have wealth, because you don't allow the economy to grow, because you can't open a factory, because you can't run it on electricity, because the trucks can't run on roads without falling into potholes, you then introduce expropriation without compensation. You say, no, the reason that we don't have an economy and the reason our people are so poor is because those people are so rich. Instead of saying, let's make the majority of South African wealth wealthier. And we know from centuries worth of research by now that a government's job is to create the infrastructure so that you can put your stuff on a train and it can get to a harbour. But instead, you blame the people who are doing it. Bread and circuses. Right? And then when all else fails, you say, no, it would be so different if there was a different CEO. So we introduce employment equity. As if another CEO would behave differently. As if another CEO, because he's black, for example, instead of a white CEO, is suddenly going to double the number of staff and increase inefficiency. Is that the hope? No, it's bread and circuses. What you want to do is you want to say, we've got a problem. Instead of solving the problem, we'll introduce some law that sits on the side. This tactic of distraction may have worked in ancient Rome, where you didn't have the internet. You didn't have smart people telling you these things. Right? But the voters told the government last year that they don't believe in their bread and circuses anymore. That's why the ANC went down to 40%. The people said they wanted a government of national unity so we could stop this. But still, our president and his party love these kind of distractions. He loves what happens in the White House recently, because when that happens, it distracts you and it distracts me from questioning them as to why they are doing such a poor job. It's bread and circuses, people. Don't fall for it. Understand the real problem that we have in South Africa is the government failing to do what we pay them to do. So please remember this. Remember and just identify those bread and circuses, and also identify Pace Car Rental when you need to rent a car again. Use our code SONA, S-O-N-A, to get a discount on a car. Subscribe to the State of the Nation. We'll see you again soon. Thank you very much for joining me. Cool. Every business needs a world-class video to show to your clients and prospective clients. When the Stream-In team isn't filming the State of the Nation, they are producing those world-class videos for companies just like yours. They have got all of the equipment, drones, microphones, whatever you need, and the technical know-how to film a proper video for your company. Visit their website.